Okay, so I want to start out with saying all of my videos on xenogenders have really just been proving that they don't exist. And while I have gone on little tangents about how they're harmful or things like that, they generally focus on the science behind it and why they're not real. And I get a lot of comments going, yeah, maybe there's no proof of them, but how are they hurting you? Or even people on my side saying, I agree with this and I agree that they're harmful, but it would probably be helpful if you would outline how they're harmful. So that's what we're going to be doing here. Let's get into it. I want to start out by saying we are taking the presupposition that xenogenders are not proven, not possible, and that brains are gendered. All of this has gone over in other videos, and I will be linking those videos if you want to go see them, but I'm not going over that again because those on their own are 20-minute videos. So if you already know that information, feel free to just skip those, but if you feel like you need some substance for that before you continue with this video, they'll be linked below. Now, one big issue I have with xenogenders is that their very quote unquote existence or claiming of existence promotes misinformation. Xenogenders rely on the idea that gender is both a social construct and that neurodivergency affects gender. These two kind of going hand in hand by saying gender is a social construct, and some neurodivergent people have a hard time understanding social constructs, and therefore their gender is better explained through xenogenders. Now, as an autistic person, I have a few issues with this argument. One, it is infantilizing. Yes, they can say, well, maybe you don't experience it that way, but some autistic people do. That's the same argument that conservatives use against trans autistic people to say, well, you're autistic, you don't understand, how do you know that you're trans? It's the same thing. You're autistic, you don't understand gender. Just instead of the conclusion being you can't possibly know you're trans, the conclusion is you have to make up a new gender to explain that experience. And of course, there's the issue of the vast majority of these people being self diagnosed, but we're not going to get too heavily into that. There's also the issue that relies on gender being a social construct, which, as I addressed in my other videos, is not true. Because for autistic people to have a hard time understanding gender, it needs to be a social construct, at least by their main argument, which it is not. So, as an autistic person who is diagnosed, I feel like saying xenogenders are for neurodivergent people or neurodivergent people have a hard time understanding social constructs is a mixture of two things. It's spreading misinformation because it's the backbone for xenogenders existing. And I think we can all agree that spreading misinformation is a bad thing and is harmful. And that is a major issue I have with it. But there's also the issue of scapegoating autistic people for your misinformation, of saying it's okay if I spread misinformation because I'm autistic. And again, there's the issue of the vast majority of these people are self-diagnosed and they're essentially allistic people, which if you don't know what that means, it basically means non-autistic people. It's allistic people who claim autism so that they can use a made-up gender. And honestly, the spreading of misinformation is my main issue because the basis of their arguments are all based on misinformation. And when promoting xenogenders, the only way you can make what seems like a cohesive argument is to invoke that misinformation. And this misinformation spreads both within the trans community and without. It makes people who are gender nonconforming think they're trans because gender is just a social construct, it's just a presentation. So if gender is just a presentation, then if I present as male, even if I feel like a girl, then I must be trans. And then that creates detransitioners, and in turn, that creates a lot of TERFs. And sure, maybe these people aren't using xenogenders, but xenogenders are being used to push this misinformation that creates that kind of person. And also the fact that it is a reused conservative argument. It's taking a conservative argument and coming to a different conclusion from it. And if the argument is bad, which I think we can all agree it's bad when conservatives use it, why is it any better when xenogender people use it? It's the same argument of autistic people can't understand gender, but on one side it's used for blatant transphobia, and on the other side it's used for spreading misinformation. There's also the issue of, although this is not exclusive to all xenogender people, it's extremely common, of label hoarding or literally claiming that your gender is just your interests or even a choice. I see lots of people, one person even being Katzun, saying that gender is nothing but a presentation and almost a political stance. That transness exists to defy gender roles, to dismantle gender hierarchies. That is not true, and it is gross. Being trans is an innate part of who someone is. It's not there to dismantle patriarchy. It's not there to make a political statement. It's not there as a presentation, as a performance. It's just what you are. And not only does this, again, spread misinformation that being trans is not innate to who you are, but it is just a dismantling of gender roles. But again, it makes people who are not trans think they're trans. And that's harmful to the trans community whenever those people become aggressive detransitioners. That's harmful to outside whenever people see trans people literally admitting, I'm not trans because it's just who I am. I'm trans because it's a political statement. It's harmful to the inside of the community too, because now our spaces are filled with people who don't experience the same things as us. They turn trans spaces from support places where people talk about what binders are safe, how to tuck safely, how to pass, how to come out, what doctors are credible, things like that. They talk, instead of talking about those, they turn into political debates. They turn into things that just overshadow actual trans issues like egg memes and this plushie is so gender, to where trans resources become hard to find because the people who are encroaching on these trans spaces are not experiencing what we're experiencing. They're just hyper leftists and want to use transness as a little pawn in their argument. And I mean, I'm very leftist. That's not shade at them being leftist. It's just that it's not, you shouldn't be taking on an identity to make a political statement or a statement on society. You should be doing it because that's genuinely who you are. Now, again, I'd like to clarify, some xenogender people do genuinely believe that they are trans and that this is what they are, and they have no opinion on how it is politically relevant. But again, it comes down to spreading misinformation and enabling someone believing that misinformation. I had a conversation, a kind of debate with someone recently, and their main argument was that we should be validating these people because it is scientifically proven that validating trans people helps their mental health. But the issue is that by using a xenogender, you are not inherently trans. You could be trans and use a xenogender because you could realize you're trans later, but using a xenogender does not inherently make you trans because the idea of xenogenders is based off of gender being a performance and gender not being real. It's not based off of an internal feeling of incongruence and dysphoria. Now, that's not to say xenogender people can't experience those things, but it's to say if they do, that encouraging them to believe that they are cat gender is basically discouraging them from exploring their gender and realizing how they may or may not want to transition by allowing them to stay complacent with something that's not only spreading misinformation, utilizing conservative arguments, essentially creating TERFs and detransitioners, and perpetuating stereotypes. It harms the community in that way, but it also harms the individual because that person may be living with that dysphoria and that discomfort longer because people are validating, yeah, you can be cat gender, just put on some cat ears and change your pronoun to kit self and you'll be fine. And then that person realizes, oh, I'm non-binary. Oh, I'm a trans woman. Oh, I'm a trans man. And they went however long without realizing that they were like that because the delusion was encouraged by the people around them. It's almost the same as the TikTok people who will claim to have psychosis and say, don't reality check me. Sure, it's not your place to go to someone who identifies with a xenogender and tell them it's not real, but you also shouldn't be encouraging it because, again, it's promoting that misinformation or at least being complacent with the misinformation, and it is allowing that person to be stagnant in self-growth. Now, there's also the issue I talk about with religion that comes back to this, and pretty much why I hold a lot of my opinions is belief without proof. There is no proof xenogenders exist, and there is proof to the contrary, saying that the spectrum of gender is essentially a sliding scale between male and female, and even non-binary people are scientifically possible, but the scale it has confines, or the spectrum has confines. It's like, I use the comparison to autism. Autism is a spectrum. Everyone experiences it a little differently, but that doesn't mean everything is encompassed in that spectrum, and it doesn't mean it's borderless. It just means it's a little different to everyone. And by invoking this idea that gender is just what you want it to be, it confuses people. It makes people think, well, gender is identity, which isn't necessarily untrue, but gender is identity. And part of my identity is I really like cats. So that must mean I'm cat gender, because both of those things are just part of who I am. And if gender is just made up, then, my gender must be that I like and relate to cats. And this is also very heavily outlined by the people who claim to be autistic, or the people who are actually autistic, using their special interests or hyperfixations as genders. Now, I can understand this to a degree as an autistic person, because my special interests and hyperfixations have very heavily impacted how I outwardly portray my gender, as well as my BPD. Whenever I have a very weak sense of identity due to my BPD, and I will latch on to, or quote unquote kin characters to give myself a sense of identity. And when that character that I am currently placing my whole identity on is female, I am much more inclined to wear feminine things, to wear makeup, to wear earrings, to even wear a skirt. But that doesn't mean that I am Toko Fukawa gender or Maple Shade gender. It means that my identity is dependent on outside sources because of my mental illness. It doesn't mean that because that affects my gender presentation that is my gender. It just means my mental illness is affecting the way I'm presenting my gender. But regardless, I still have dysphoria. I still prefer he, him pronouns. I am still confident that if I got an fMRI scan, I would be perceived as male. I'm not warrior cat gender because my BPD makes me latch on to a character heavily and relate to that character. And I'm not BPD gender, which, yes, people claim is a thing, because my BPD affects my gender presentation. Those are two separate parts of who I am that function separately neurologically. And this is where I'm going to go into neurogenders, which are basically believing that your mental illness or neurodivergency, depending on which one it is, affects your gender. Some I have seen that I know exist for a fact, although I'm sure they probably exist for every disorder, are ADHD gender, Audi gender, autism gender, BPD gender, NPD gender, plethora of things. And while, like I said, my BPD can affect the ways I feel comfortable presenting my gender, it is not in and of itself affecting my actual gender. And if anything, I think that these people who claim to want to dismantle gender roles so heavily are doing nothing but conflating gender roles and gender presentation with gender itself. And gender roles are harmful. They put people in boxes that don't need to be there. And as much as these people claim to hate gender roles, they are heavily conflating the way that they present their gender and the roles that they fit into with what gender they actually are. I am not BPD gender because sometimes when I relate to a character I'm obsessed with and place my identity on, it makes me present more female or masculine or androgynous. I am still a man. I am just affected in the way that I feel comfortable presenting. Not the way that I am, not the way that I actually exist, not the way that my neurology is structured, but just the way that I currently feel comfortable presenting. I am not BPD gender, and I'm not danganronpa gender. I'm a man with a mental illness. And of course, this comes down to the issue of neurodivergent neurogenders versus mental illness neurogenders. But when it comes to the non-autistic ones, because I don't really think you can enable autism, it's just the way you are. But when it comes down to things like ADHD gender or BPD gender or depression gender or things like that, I think these neurogenders are really just encouraging harmful coping mechanisms based on those disorders. I, as a BPD person, don't feel like it's healthy that I am in a good mindset whenever I am so fixated on acting like and presenting as a fictional character that I sort of relate to, because I have no sense of identity that I need to latch on to something else. That's an unhealthy coping mechanism. But if I were to say I'm BPD gender because of the way that my BPD affects my gender presentation, it would be enabling that unhealthy coping mechanism. And of course, like I said, this is heavily dependent on which neurogender you're talking about. I don't really think this applies to like the Audi gender thing or whatever, but it is still a thing that exists, well, claims to exist, that I don't think is helping people. And I mean, like I said earlier, to a degree, this does apply to the regular xenogenders that are like cat gender or deer gender or whatever, because it's discouraging you from exploring actual gender identity, and it's keeping you in a state of not understanding your gender when, let's be real, people don't stick with these identities for long. They are placeholders. Even if they use xenogenders for a long time, people don't stick with one xenogender for a long time. And that's because they're placeholders. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with a placeholder identity, when that identity doesn't exist and is being encouraged as this is who you actually are, as opposed to, yeah, I'll go with it while you're believing it, but let's work on that. It's a problem. It's keeping people stagnant in self-growth and development. And I'm not going to encourage that. I generally avoid interacting with these people because I don't really think I get anything out of it. Neither do they, out of me directly invalidating them unless they come to me. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to support it just out of the virtue that, well, they're working on it. Because no, if everyone just goes around supporting it and saying it's valid, they're never going to realize that that's not real. It's enabling a delusion. And I guess the last point is it's not scientifically possible. It doesn't exist. And I don't think promoting falsehoods is good. Same reason I don't support religion, self-diagnosis, spirituality, alternative medicine, any of those things. It's false. Promoting falsehoods is wrong. I do not support it. So I guess to sum up and end the video, it promotes misinformation because the main arguments for xenogenders and the reasons that people believe they exist are based on misinformation. It recycles conservative talking points for a different argument, therefore giving validation to those arguments in different contexts. It discourages self-growth and self-exploration. Depending on the neurogender, it can enable unhealthy coping mechanisms. And also just, it's lying. It's not real and it's promoting something that's not true. I have a lot more to say, honestly, but this is 16 minutes now, not counting my intro, so we're gonna end it here. If you want a part 2, I'll be happy to make one. I just don't want this to be a 40-minute video. So thank you guys for watching. I hope that this gave a little bit of insight onto why I think they're harmful as opposed to just why I don't think they exist. Ha det!
I stare at the populace in